Edward opened his eyes. He didn't know how long it had been since he last looked at the sky. The sun was at its zenith, and its rays burned as though trying to sear his skin. He swallowed, but his throat felt dry, as though everything he had ever known about water had disappeared. His gaze drifted across the sandy ocean stretching to the horizon. There was nothing, just lifeless sand and the harsh sky above, with no refuge in sight. But beside him stood her, Sky, the horse, his faithful companion, the one he'd shared so many difficult moments with. And now, in this unforgiving place, she was his last hope. Edward ran a weak hand down her rough neck. She stood motionless, her eyes, though tired, never leaving his. In those eyes, he saw not only pain, but also hope. The hope that they could move forward. And although her body had begun to fail her, her spirit remained unbroken. He glanced at his own hands. His fingers were curled from exhaustion, nails chipped, and his skin marked with cuts from the relentless sand. But those were not the worst wounds. The worst wounds were the emptiness gnawing inside him, making every step feel unbearably heavy. "We have to keep going," he whispered to himself, trying to find the strength to rise. But his legs didn't respond. With each step, it felt as if the world around him was losing shape, as if the very sand itself was swallowing him. His heart pulsed with one thought: find salvation, even if it lay beyond the realm of possibility. He looked back at Sky. She stood, as always, waiting. He knew that without her strength and endurance, he would have given up long ago. Sky was the one who had led him through everything, even when he didn't know where to go. She was his friend, his protector. Edward took a few steps, feeling the sand shift beneath him. He leaned on Sky, her course for a reliable support in this merciless world. His fingers brushed through her mane, and perhaps, in that moment, their bond grew even stronger. He couldn't go alone, and she couldn't go alone. Together, they were stronger than they were apart. Hours passed, and despite all his efforts, the desert showed no signs of mercy. Suddenly, Edward spotted a small rise in the distance. Its shape was faint and blurred, like a mirage. He squinted, trying to make out what it might be. Fear mixed with hope. Was this reality, or just a trick of the sun? But Sky moved forward, without warning, as always. She seemed to sense something, and she began to move in that direction, as if knowing that it was their chance. Edward followed her, forcing himself to keep walking despite the pain in his body. He knew that if he didn't move, there would be no more life left to live. With each step, his strength drained away. The sand beneath his feet grew hotter, and Edward's breath became shallow. He barely noticed as the sun began to dip lower, offering the desert the coolness of nightfall. But Sky kept going, her steps steady, her rhythm unbroken. Finally, when they reached the rise, Edward felt his legs give out beneath him. He collapsed onto the ground, and in that moment, it was as if he had found salvation. He was still alive. His chest rose and fell with each heavy breath, his eyes still fixed on Sky. She stopped beside him, her body trembling from exhaustion, but her eyes still held determination. Edward wiped his face, trying to pull himself together. Here, at this rise, he noticed something that had saved them. It was a small cave, hidden in the rocks, a shelter that might protect them from the night's cold and, at least for a while, shield them from the relentless sun. Edward took a step forward, helping Sky into the cave. It was cool inside, and the air filled his lungs, making him feel like he could breathe again, like they were safe, if only for a moment. This was their salvation. They had found a place to wait out the night. He struggled to remove his backpack, reaching inside to pull out water, and carefully fed it to Sky before taking a few sips himself. Every drop was precious. In the desert, where nothing existed, every drop of water was like a miracle. Edward sank down beside the horse, his head resting on her rough neck. He felt her warmth and the steady rhythm of her breathing. She was alive. She was there. And that meant more than anything else. "You saved me," he whispered softly, barely audible, but deep inside. He knew the words were true. Without Sky, he would not have made it through this day. And perhaps, without her, he wouldn't make it through the next. Sky didn't respond, but her eyes, full of quiet understanding, said more than any words ever could. In that silence, in the shadows of the cave, they were no longer just a man and a horse. They were a team, and together they had defied the desert. In that moment, the desert didn't seem so vast. But before we continue, you have to subscribe and like. Edward opened his eyes. He didn't know how long it had been since he last looked at the sky. The sun was at its zenith, and its rays burned as though trying to sear his skin. He swallowed, but his throat felt dry, as though everything he had ever known about water had disappeared. His gaze drifted across the sandy ocean stretching to the horizon. There was nothing, just lifeless sand and the harsh sky above, with no refuge in sight. But beside him stood her. Sky, the horse, his faithful companion, the one he'd shared so many difficult moments with. And now, in this unforgiving place, she was his last hope. Edward ran a weak hand down her rough neck. She stood motionless, her eyes, though tired, never leaving his. In those eyes, he saw not only pain, but also hope. The hope that they could move forward. And although her body had begun to fail her, her spirit remained unbroken. He glanced at his own hands. His fingers were curled from exhaustion, nails chipped, and his skin marked with cuts from the relentless sand. But those were not the worst wounds. The worst wounds were the emptiness gnawing inside him, making every step feel unbearably heavy. "We have to keep going," he whispered to himself, trying to find the strength to rise. But his legs didn't respond. With each step, it felt as if the world around him was losing shape, as if the very sand itself was swallowing him. His heart pulsed with one thought: find salvation, even if it lay beyond the realm of possibility. He looked back at Sky. She stood, as always, waiting. He knew that without her strength and endurance, he would have given up long ago. Sky was the one who had led him through everything, even when he didn't know where to go. She was his friend, his protector. Edward took a few steps, feeling the sand shift beneath him. He leaned on Sky, her course for a reliable support in this merciless world. His fingers brushed through her mane, and perhaps, in that moment, their bond grew even stronger. He couldn't go alone, and she couldn't go alone. Together, they were stronger than they were apart. Hours passed, and despite all his efforts, the desert showed no signs of mercy. Suddenly, Edward spotted a small rise in the distance. Its shape was faint and blurred, like a mirage. He squinted, trying to make out what it might be. Fear mixed with hope. Was this reality, or just a trick of the sun? But Sky moved forward, without warning, as always. She seemed to sense something, and she began to move in that direction, as if knowing that it was their chance. Edward followed her, forcing himself to keep walking despite the pain in his body. He knew that if he didn't move, there would be no more life left to live. With each step, his strength drained away. The sand beneath his feet grew hotter, and Edward's breath became shallow. He barely noticed as the sun began to dip lower, offering the desert the coolness of nightfall. But Sky kept going, her steps steady, her rhythm unbroken. Finally, when they reached the rise, Edward felt his legs give out beneath him. He collapsed onto the ground, and in that moment, it was as if he had found salvation. He was still alive. His chest rose and fell with each heavy breath, his eyes still fixed on Sky. She stopped beside him, her body trembling from exhaustion, but her eyes still held determination. Edward wiped his face, trying to pull himself together. Here, at this rise, he noticed something that had saved them. It was a small cave, hidden in the rocks, a shelter that might protect them from the night's cold and, at least for a while, shield them from the relentless sun. Edward took a step forward, helping Sky into the cave. It was cool inside, and the air filled his lungs, making him feel like he could breathe again, like they were safe, if only for a moment. This was their salvation. They had found a place to wait out the night. He struggled to remove his backpack, reaching inside to pull out water, and carefully fed it to Sky before taking a few sips himself. Every drop was precious. In the desert, where nothing existed, every drop of water was like a miracle. Edward sank down beside the horse, his head resting on her rough neck. He felt her warmth and the steady rhythm of her breathing. She was alive. She was there. And that meant more than anything else. "You saved me," he whispered softly, barely audible, but deep inside. He knew the words were true. Without Sky, he would not have made it through this day. And perhaps, without her, he wouldn't make it through the next. Sky didn't respond, but her eyes, full of quiet understanding, said more than any words ever could. In that silence, in the shadows of the cave, they were no longer just a man and a horse. They were a team, and together they had defied the desert. In that moment, the desert didn't seem so vast. By mid-morning, the heat was already unbearable. The sun had risen fast, sharp and merciless, baking the sand until it shimmered like water. Edward moved slowly, each step an effort not just of muscle, but of will. The desert had taken from him water, strength, direction, but it hadn't yet taken Sky. And so he pressed forward. The dunes rose and fell like waves on a lifeless ocean. Sky walked beside him, her gait slower now, each breath drawn deeper than the last. Edward could see it in the way her ears flicked back more often, how her stride hesitated every so often. She was hurting. He wished he could do something for her. Anything. A place to rest. A bucket of water. A word that meant more than just keep going. But out here, there were no such gifts. Just sand. Just sun. Just silence. A few vultures circled far above. Edward didn't look up. They walked for hours. Once, when he stumbled, Sky stopped. Her head turned toward him slowly, and for a second, her eyes locked with his. It wasn't panic. It wasn't pity. Just a quiet question. "Are we still going?" Edward nodded. They went on. At some point, Edward stopped feeling the pain in his legs. That scared him more than the pain had. Numbness meant the beginning of something worse. He forced himself to drink the last of his water. It was barely a mouthful. Warm. Metallic. Gone. He tilted the canteen to Sky's lips. She sniffed it but didn't drink. Empty. He let it fall into the sand. The afternoon brought mirages, the kind that shimmered on the horizon, bending light into cruel illusions of rivers and lakes. Once, Edward thought he saw a tree, an acacia, tall and casting shade. He nearly cried, then blinked, and it was gone. Sky didn't chase the mirages. She just kept walking. That steadiness, that unshakable rhythm, was what Edward held on to. Even as his body betrayed him, even as the world blurred, that rhythm stayed. The sound of her hooves in the sand, the creak of old leather, the breath of a creature that refused to give in. It saved him. Later, maybe 2 hours past noon, the wind changed. It came suddenly, a gust so strong it kicked up a wall of sand. Edward turned away, pulling his shirt over his mouth. Sky lowered her head, her eyes narrowing against the sting. Visibility vanished. Just red dust and wind. They crouched low behind a dune, waiting it out. Sand scraped across Edward's arms like shards of glass. He kept one hand on Sky's flank, grounding himself in her presence. After what felt like a lifetime, the wind faded. When the world returned, it looked different. The dunes had shifted. Any trail they'd been following, imagined or not, was gone. Edward stood slowly, blinking grit from his eyes. Sky rose too, though slower this time. She looked tired, worn in a way that frightened him. Her legs trembled beneath her. He pressed his forehead to hers. Just for a second. No words. No weight. Just breath. Just presence. They walked again. As the sun began to dip, Edward's vision blurred. Not from exhaustion this time, but something else. On the edge of a dune far ahead, there was something. Not sand. Not sky. A structure. He blinked hard, rubbed his eyes. It was still there. A ruin. Crumbled walls. Maybe part of an old outpost, long abandoned. Maybe not real. But Edward didn't care. He picked up his pace, stumbling forward. He didn't look back to see if Sky was still following. The ruin was real. Stone and shadow. A low structure with just enough left, standing to break the wind. He collapsed inside, dropping to his knees. The air inside was cooler. And there, almost miraculously, was a cracked basin, half filled with rainwater. Stagnant green, but water. He dipped his hands in. It wasn't clean. He didn't care. Sky arrived a few moments later, slower than before. Her legs quivered as she stepped through the crumbling stone arch. Edward brought the water to her, letting her drink before he took another sip himself. Her eyes met his again, and this time something changed. She sagged. Not collapsed, but rested. Deeply. He watched her breathe. Her sides rose and fell, slow and deliberate. She had given everything today. More than any animal should be asked to. More than any friend should be expected to. He reached out, brushing sand from her muzzle. She didn't move. The light outside faded, and the desert shifted into night once again. Inside the ruins, it felt like they had carved out a world apart. A pocket of safety, of silence, untouched by the sun's cruelty. Edward lay back against the cool stone, his fingers still brushing Sky's mane. For the first time in days, he didn't feel fear pressing down on his chest. Not because the danger had passed, but because she was still there, breathing. With him. He closed his eyes. And this time, sleep came. The morning came too soon. Edward awoke to the slow stirrings of Sky, her hooves shifting in the dust. The light that bled into the ruins was soft, gray-blue, cooler than the fiery sun that would soon rise. But there was something in the air, something dry, bitter, a smell like old smoke, though nothing burned. He sat up slowly. His muscles ached less than yesterday, but only because they'd grown used to pain. Sky stood by the broken arch, staring east, where the dunes rolled on like broken waves. She didn't look back at him, just stared. That worried him. He stepped outside and followed her gaze. There, on the horizon, was something strange. A thin line of black stretching across the sand. Straight. Too straight to be natural. Edward's heart stuttered. A road? He squinted harder. Not quite. More like remnants. A path, maybe. The faint echo of something once solid, once traveled. Either way, it was direction. Something the desert rarely gave. He turned to Sky. We go that way. She didn't move at first. Then, slowly, she nodded her head once. He recognized it now, not obedience. Agreement. They left the ruins behind. The path was strange. Not paved, but firm beneath the sand, as if something had once passed through here many times. Perhaps carts, travelers, maybe soldiers. Bones littered it in places. Bird bones. Jackals. Something older, too, curved and yellowed by time. Sky picked her steps carefully. Edward did the same. Neither of them spoke, not even with their eyes. There was something sacred in this silence now, the way it had shaped them. It was as though the desert had carved away everything else, fear, anger, hope, and left only motion, the will to continue. By midday, the wind returned, but softer this time. It whistled through the sand, brushing against their clothes like old hands. And in that wind, Edward began to hear things. Not voices, not really, but echoes. Laughter, faint and distant. A child's giggle. His mother's voice calling his name from across a green field. The sound of Sky galloping through the rain. Her hooves splashing in puddles back home. He didn't believe in ghosts. But now, he wondered if the desert did. Later, they reached a cluster of rocks shaped like bent towers. Wind-worn. Hollow. One looked like the remains of an old monument, half buried. Maybe there had been a civilization here once. Now there was only emptiness. They took shelter there for a time, beneath the largest spire. Edward chewed on a piece of dried root. Sky found a patch of scrub to nibble. It was dry, brittle, but she accepted it. He reached out, brushing his hand along her shoulder. "You still with me, girl?" She didn't look at him, but she leaned into the touch. Afternoon felt like a weight. The heat made the air shimmer. Sand curled around their feet like smoke. Sky stumbled once. Her front leg buckled, but she caught herself before falling. Edward rushed to her side, arms up, ready to hold her if she collapsed. But she didn't. She stood. Barely. Her breathing was rough now, more labored. Edward pressed his forehead to hers again, whispering words neither of them could afford to believe in anymore. "You're all right," he said. "Just a little further." She didn't blink, but he could feel her shaking. Still, they kept walking. By sunset, Edward saw something that made his legs go weak. A structure. Real this time. It stood low and wide on the horizon. Not stone, but metal, rusted, sun-warped. A small outpost. Maybe an old ranger station or desert depot. Long abandoned, but standing. He nearly cried out. He turned to Sky. Her eyes had dulled, but when she saw what he saw, her ears perked, just slightly. Enough to let him know she saw it too. They moved faster. The last half-mile was brutal. Every step pulled at Edward's body like a hook. But he didn't stop. Sky limped beside him now, but she matched his pace. They reached the door, just as darkness claimed the sky. It was locked, rusted shut. Edward kicked it once, twice. On the third time, the hinge gave with a screech. Inside, the air was thick with dust, but cool. Blessedly cool. He pulled Sky in after him and collapsed to the floor. There was no light, no furniture, just shadows and silence. But they were inside. Safe for now. He found an old tank near the back. Broken pipes, but at the bottom, water. Rainwater, likely. Collected over years. Not much, but enough. He scooped it into a cracked pot and brought it to Sky. She drank slowly, then lifted her head, and for the first time in days, she exhaled, not in pain, not in exhaustion, but in relief. Edward sat beside her, his hand resting on her side. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The stars outside blinked into view, one by one, and inside, man and horse breathed together in the quiet. They had made it, through ash, through bone, through everything the desert could throw at them. They were still standing, together. The wind changed again that night. Edward woke with a start, the cold air brushing across his face like fingertips. He sat up in the rusted outpost, blinking against the dark. Sky lay nearby, curled on her side, her body rising and falling in slow, steady waves. She was still breathing. That was all he needed. But something had shifted. The silence felt different, lighter, like the desert was no longer pressing down on them, but holding its breath. Edward stood, muscles stiff from sleep. He stepped outside, into the sand-choked dusk. The sky was clear, a deep violet stitched with stars. The wind rolled past him, carrying something strange, a sound. Distant, faint. He closed his eyes. Engines. Faint. Far off. But real. His heart kicked once, hard. Somewhere out there, someone was moving. At first light, they moved again. Slowly. Sky limped more now. Her front leg dragged slightly, her steps uneven. But when Edward tried to lead her with the rope, she refused. She pushed forward on her own. Stubborn girl. Together, They followed the wind. The path veered west, toward a series of rock formations Edward remembered passing in the mirage 2 days ago. Only now they were solid, real. Beyond them, the faintest shimmer of motion. Something metallic. Vehicles. Edward couldn't believe it at first. But as they crested a low dune, it became undeniable. Trucks. Military, maybe. Parked in the lee of a cliff. Tents. Movement. People. He didn't shout. Didn't run. Just turned to Sky and whispered, "We're here." She didn't react. Just blinked slowly, her breath shallow. Edward moved faster, stumbling down the dune. The first man who saw him froze, then shouted for help. Two more appeared from behind a truck, one with a radio, the other already reaching for water. When Edward fell to his knees, they caught him. But all he could say was, "The horse. Please, help her." They looked up the dune and saw her, silhouetted by the rising sun, still standing. Barely. They treated her better than he could have hoped. She was taken to a shaded enclosure, given clean water, cool towels, and rest. A medic checked her legs. "You're lucky," he said. "She should have dropped days ago." Edward didn't leave her side. Not once. Even when they offered him a cot, a hot meal, a shower, he stayed with her. When she finally lay down to sleep, "Safe," he cried. Not loud, not broken, just a quiet unraveling of something he'd held too tightly for too long. That night, one of the medics, a woman named Reyes, sat beside him. She'd seen a lot of desert crossings, she said. Refugees, nomads, some desperate travelers, trying to take shortcuts across the endless heat. But no one had come as far as him, not with a horse. "She kept you alive," she said softly. Edward looked down at Sky. Her breathing was calmer now, her body still, but peaceful. "She did more than that," he murmured. In the days that followed, they recovered. Sky's leg was wrapped. She wouldn't run again for a while, but she was walking, eating, watching the wind with those same sharp, knowing eyes. Edward spent his time sitting with her, brushing her coat, telling her stories she couldn't understand, but somehow, he knew she listened. She always had. When the relief convoy finally headed back toward the nearest outpost town, they offered him a seat in the lead vehicle. A comfortable ride. Safe. He declined. He climbed onto Sky instead. The others looked at him like he was mad, but they didn't understand. She'd walked with him across hell. He'd finished the journey by her side. The desert looked different now. Not gentler, not kinder, but known. The same dunes that once threatened to swallow them now rose like old guardians, watching them pass. Sky walked slow, but steady. Her limp was there, yes, but there was strength in her again, a quiet resolve that mirrored Edward's own. They rode into town 5 days later, dust-covered, weather-worn, but alive. A stable boy rushed to take Sky's reins. Edward paused. Then slowly, he took her bridle off. "She's not a mount," he said. "She's family." He stayed in town for a while, got work, cleaned up, wrote letters home, long ones. But every evening, before the sun dipped too low, he went out to the edge of the stables, where Sky grazed in a small, open field. He'd sit on the fence, watching her with that same quiet awe, because when everything else had fallen away, the maps, the supplies, the strength, the hope, she had remained. Not just a horse, not just a survivor, but the soul that refused to leave him behind. In the end, it wasn't the water or the shade or the kindness of strangers that saved Edward. It was the bond between two souls, one with a voice and one with hooves, and that bond carried them home. The desert wasn't done with him. Edward thought he'd left its grip behind, thought the dunes would fade into memory, into something dreamlike and distant. But he was wrong. Even months after the journey, after Sky's recovery and the return of warm meals and clean water, something followed him. Not sand in his boots or heat in his skin, but silence. The deep, bone-deep kind that only the desert teaches. He couldn't shake it. He worked odd jobs in the edge town, delivering parcels between stations, repairing tack at the stable, occasionally helping local kids ride. He spoke little, smiled when spoken to. People liked him, but no one really knew him, except Sky. She was healing well. Her limp had faded into a subtle rhythm, and her coat, though speckled now with silver, caught the morning light like polished stone. She roamed the paddock freely, but never wandered far. She was always waiting, always watching. Edward often stood at the fence long after sundown, just watching her graze. And on windless nights, when the air felt still and weightless, he sometimes heard it again, the wind from the dunes. Not a sound, not quite. More like a pressure in his chest, a hum in his bones. A reminder. One evening, Reyes, the same medic who'd helped them both back at the convoy, came to visit the town on her supply run. She found Edward at the stables, brushing Sky's mane with steady hands. "You ever think of going back?" she asked. He didn't look up. "To the desert?" "No," she said. "To life." He paused. Then, very slowly, he said, "This is life." She smiled, but didn't argue. Instead, she left a package with him. "Found this in an old transport journal. Thought you'd want it." Inside was a map, old sun-stained, but on it, marked faintly in pencil, was a line. A trail that passed right through the place Edward remembered. The stone ruins, the outpost, the bones buried in sand. But the line didn't stop there. It curved onward, deeper, toward a place marked only as a Mars Hollow. Edward's heart stirred. He'd heard the name before, once years ago, from a trader who spoke of a vanished place at the edge of the salt flats. A canyon swallowed by dunes, where the wind spoke like voices. A place people found, and rarely returned from. He folded the map carefully. Didn't say a word, but Sky, standing nearby, had already lifted her head, as if she knew. That night, the dreams returned. Not of thirst or hunger, but of footsteps in the sand. And eyes. Eyes watching him, from just over the next dune. Not threatening, just present. Familiar. He woke in a cold sweat, and Sky was already standing at the door of her stable, waiting. 3 days later, he packed his things. Water, salt meat, a flint, a small satchel of herbs Reyes had left him, for wounds and heat sickness. He checked the saddle twice, then once more, just to feel the leather beneath his fingers. When he stepped into the paddock, Sky trotted over before he could even whistle. He rested his forehead against hers again. It had become their ritual, a silent promise. "Just one more ride," he whispered. She didn't flinch. She never did. They left at dawn. No one stopped them. A few locals nodded, assuming Edward was off on another small delivery run. But Reyes, standing near her jeep at the edge of town, gave a slow wave. She knew. The sun rose at their backs as they returned to the place where the silence lived. By the second day, Edward felt it, the shift in the air, the stillness, the way the heat leaned in close, not to burn, but to listen. They passed the old ruins again, the place where Sky had saved him. He stopped for a while, sat in the same shade. The air tasted different now, like memory. They didn't stay long, because now there was a trail, and the map pointed forward. On the third day, the land began to change. The sand grew finer, lighter, almost white. The sun didn't feel as hot here, sharper maybe, like glass instead of flame. They followed the edge of a dry riverbed, cracked and brittle underfoot. That night, they found the bones of another horse, long buried, mostly covered by drifting sand. Edward said nothing, but Sky paused beside it, lowering her head briefly before moving on. As if she was saying goodbye. To what? He didn't ask. By the fifth night, Edward saw something impossible. A firelight. Flickering. Steady. Far across the flats. Someone or something was there. He tethered Sky beneath a sandstone ledge and crawled up the ridge with his spyglass. There were figures. 3, maybe 4. Dressed in long desert wraps, their heads covered. No vehicles. No signs of camp, just the fire. Sitting. Waiting. He didn't go to them. Not yet. But the wind shifted as he watched, curling around his ears like a whisper. It didn't say words, but it asked something. "Why did you come back?" Edward clenched his jaw. "I never left." He returned to Sky. She was still awake, head lifted toward the direction of the fire, her ears flicking. She had felt it too. They lay in silence that night, and in the distance, the fire never dimmed. It just burned, waiting. They moved at first light. Edward didn't speak. He hadn't since the firelight, since the shapes in the dark, since the wind carried voices that didn't belong to anything with a mouth. Sky felt it too. Her steps were cautious, hooves sinking into the finer sand like it held memories. The desert wasn't empty here. It remembered, Each dune felt older, heavier, as if the land itself had been waiting for someone to return, as if it remembered him. The map was almost unreadable now, stained with sweat and sun, the pencil markings barely visible. But Edward didn't need it anymore. His path was inside him. A direction felt more than known. They passed the remnants of an old boundary marker, a pole snapped in half, its flag long devoured by wind. Beyond it, the land sloped downward into a shallow basin where the air shimmered strange, like heat rising from ice, not fire. This wasn't just desert anymore. It was something older, something buried. Midday, the sun high, but its warmth distant. A thin mist clung to the sand, not enough to cool, just enough to blur the edges of reality. Skye stopped, not from exhaustion, but alertness. Her ears flicked forward. Her chest rose sharp. Edward froze beside her, hand instinctively going to her mane. Then he saw it. Footprints. Not his. Not hers. Fresh. Boots narrow-soled. The kind worn by desert scouts. Heading in the same direction they were walking. But not in a straight line. They weaved. Looped. Doubled back. As if whoever left them wasn't walking with purpose, but circling. Watching. Hunting. Edward crouched, pressing a hand into one of the prints. Still soft. Maybe a few hours old. Skye nudged him. Not anxious. Just insistent. He stood, and they kept walking, but slower now. Eyes open. They came across the well by accident. It was barely visible, a stone ring sunken into the sand, half covered by a dune's curve. The old wood beam across the top was cracked and worn by time. A bucket lay splintered beside it, but the rope was intact. Edward pulled it up, hand over hand. It creaked in protest, sand falling from every knot. The bucket rose, and with it sound. A slosh. Water. He stared, then laughed once. Short, disbelieving. He held it up to Skye. She sniffed it, then drank. Greedily. Edward followed. The taste was stale, metallic. But it was real. Something had been left here. Something someone meant to return to. Later, they found the stones. Not random. Not natural. Stacked in patterns. Circles. Triangles. Markers, maybe. Ritual, maybe not. Some were carved with lines that made Edward's eyes blur to look at them too long. Skye avoided them instinctively. Smart girl. They went around. By nightfall, the wind had changed again. Not stronger, just stranger. It came in pulses, like breath. And with it sounds. Not voices this time. Metal. Chains. Edward didn't sleep. Skye stayed standing. They waited out the dark. And when dawn finally stretched its fingers over the horizon, they moved. Faster. By the second morning, Edward spotted something new: poles. Thin wooden stakes rising from the sand every 50 paces. He followed them, and the pattern sharpened into a road, buried beneath the dunes, but still there. Once paved. Once known. He'd found the old caravan path. The one they said led to a Mars Hollow. It was real. Midday brought heat again. Not unbearable, but persistent. The mist had vanished. The world was sharper. And in that clarity, Edward saw something that made his stomach turn. A body, curled against a rock, half covered in sand, a sun-bleached scarf over its face. He approached slowly. No signs of injury. No blood. Just stillness. The man had sat down and never got up. Next to him, a canteen. Still half full. Edward closed the man's eyes with his thumb, then poured a splash of water onto the sand beside him. For the desert. For the dead. Skye nuzzled the man's boot gently, then turned away. They made camp under the arch of a broken canyon wall. The rocks here rose in sharp, unnatural lines, like ribs, Edward thought, like the skeleton of some ancient thing long buried. He set no fire, ate little, but Skye ate. That was enough. That night, the stars came out, brighter here than anywhere else. 1,000 quiet watchers. And Edward dreamed again. But this time he wasn't alone. In the dream, he stood at the center of a circle of stone, and Sky was beside him. But so was someone else, a child. Not his. Not anyone he remembered. Just a small figure with eyes full of sand and starlight. They didn't speak. They just pointed. Toward the west. Toward the hollow. Edward woke just before dawn. Sky was already watching him. The next morning, the sky was red. A blood dawn. Edward had seen one before, years ago. It meant change. It meant weather. It meant something was coming. They moved faster. By noon, the air had grown thick. Not hot. Not cold. Just charged. Like lightning before the flash. And then, in the distance, a shape. A dip in the earth. Shadows rising like teeth from the sand. Cliffs. Canyon walls. A hollow in the world. They had arrived. Edward didn't speak. Sky didn't flinch. They descended the slope together, the road forgotten behind them, the sun at their backs. Whatever waited inside that place, they would face it together, just like always. The canyon walls rose around them like ancient sentinels, their faces carved by centuries of wind and time. Edward felt the temperature shift the moment they entered. The sun softened, the air cooled. Shadows stretched longer here, as if time moved differently beneath the cliffs. Sky walked close now. No rope, no reins. Just beside him. The wind didn't howl here, it whispered. Every gust slipped through narrow cracks in the stone, carrying voices made not of words, but memory. Edward didn't try to understand them. He only listened. The path narrowed. Ahead, stones formed steps, not natural, but worn down by generations of feet. Sky hesitated at the first one, then stepped forward, carefully, trusting. Together, they climbed. Halfway up the ledge, Edward spotted it. Marks on the canyon wall. Not writing, not symbols. Just lines. Hundreds of them, layered and overlapping, each carved by hand. Not art. Not map. Something simpler. Tally marks. Each one meant someone had passed this way. Or tried. Sky brushed her shoulder against his gently, snapping him out of the thought. Still here. Still moving. At the top, the canyon opened into a bowl of cracked stone and dry earth. Ruins dotted the edges, low walls, the frames of what might have been homes or altars, now worn to dust and memory. In the center stood a tree. A single dead tree. Its bark silvered by time, limbs twisted into jagged fingers grasping at the sky. But around its roots, green. Barely. Small, stubborn weeds clawing up through the rock. Life. Edward stepped toward it, but Sky stopped. She didn't resist, just didn't follow. Her ears twitched. Her body tensed. He turned to her. What is it? She didn't move. Didn't need to. Edward felt it too. Someone was here. From behind the far wall, a figure appeared. Tall. Wrapped in loose, sand-stained cloth. A face hidden by layers. Only the eyes visible, dark and still. The stranger carried no weapon. Just a staff carved from bone-white wood. They didn't speak. Just watched. Edward raised a hand. No answer. The silence stretched until it snapped. Why did you come here? The stranger asked. Their voice was low. Uncertain. As if unused. Edward looked back at Sky. Then forward again. I didn't come to take anything, he said. Only to understand. The stranger studied him for a long moment. Then slowly they nodded and turned away. They led him around the edge of the hollow, past more ruins, more markers. No signs of life, but nothing felt dead either. Just quiet, reverent. At the far end of the canyon sat a small alcove, half hidden by vines. Inside a pool. Not deep, crystal clear. Its surface perfectly still. The heart, the stranger said. It remembers everyone who came before. Edward knelt by the water, looked into it, saw nothing. But when he dipped his fingers in, the surface rippled, and something flickered. Images. A man riding alone. A girl with a broken compass. A child leading a horse across burning sand. Not stories. Not visions. Just echoes. Sky stepped beside him now, her head low, eyes half-lidded. She saw them too. He didn't need to ask. They weren't the first, but maybe the last for a while. The stranger left them without a word. Edward didn't try to follow. Instead, he lay beside the pool with Sky, the rock warm beneath them. The air here smelled different. Not clean, not sweet, but grounded. Like roots. Like memory. Sky rested her head on his chest, and for the first time in weeks, maybe months, he slept without dreaming. He woke to the sound of Sky drinking. The pool in the alcove barely rippled, even as her muzzle dipped and rose again. Edward stayed still, watching her in the low dawn light. Her coat shimmered faintly, dirtier now, faded, but somehow more alive than ever. She turned her head toward him, eyes sharp, a soft snort. Time to go. The stranger didn't return, but something else had. As they stepped out of the alcove and back into the open basin, the air had changed. The silence had weight. Not oppressive, just full. Full of what had been said in no words at all. The ruins whispered with meaning now. A language spoken in cracked stone and twisted roots. Edward looked around one last time. He wasn't sure what he'd expected to find in a Mars Hollow answers. A map. Forgiveness? Instead, it had given him reflection. The kind that lives in your bones and doesn't speak until years later. He touched the tree at the center, just once. Its bark was dry, but warm, like the memory of fire. Then they left. The climb out was harder than the descent. The wind pushed at their backs now, but not cruelly. Like it was trying to help. Like it wanted them gone, but safe. Sky didn't stumble once. Her limp had faded into a rhythm. A slight hesitation, but no pain. They moved as one. At the top of the canyon, Edward paused. Something had changed behind them. He looked back and saw no hollow, no tree, no pool. Just rocks and wind and endless dust. Gone, or hidden, or never there. Sky didn't look back at all. She already knew. They followed the old stakes again, half buried in sand. But the road felt lighter now, as if each step no longer cost so much. Edward let the reins go. Sky walked freely. That evening, they made camp beneath a leaning stone spire. The sun dipped low, and the sky turned the color of faded embers. Edward lit a small fire, the first in days. Not for warmth, just light. Sky stood near, dozing head low. Edward watched the flames. He thought of his sister, of the message he never sent, of the last words they said. Words shouted over a phone line with static, before silence swallowed them for good. She'd said, "You're always running." And he had been. From war. From love. From himself. But not anymore. Not since Sky. When he slept that night, the dreams came gently. He stood at the edge of the hollow again, but this time, the stranger stood beside him. No scarf. Just a human face. Young. Scarred. Eyes like iron, rusted but unbroken. They said nothing, but they handed Edward something small. A piece of ash, shaped like a coin. He woke with his hand clenched. Empty. But it still felt warm. They found a ridge the next morning that overlooked the valley ahead. In the distance, smoke. Not dark. Not fire. Chimney smoke. A town. Tiny. Scattered. But real. Sky let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. Edward put a hand on her neck. "Almost there," he said. She leaned into it. And together, they started the descent. They reached the edge of the town, just as the sun fell behind the ridge. No welcome party. No gates. Just low houses huddled together like old friends. their roofs patched with tarps, and their windows glowing warm in the dusk. Skye hesitated at the first step onto the gravel road. Her ears flicked, her head low. The smell of firewood peopled dogs. It was a world she hadn't walked through in a long time. Neither had Edward. A child peeked from behind a doorway. An older man watched from his porch, cigarette in one hand, silence in the other. But no one said a word. They just watched a man and a horse walk out of the desert like a dream from some story their grandparents used to tell. They found a stable at the far end of town. The boy there, no older than 16, didn't ask questions. He just led Skye to a stall and brought her fresh hay and clean water. "She yours?" the boy asked. Edward hesitated, then nodded. "No, I'm hers." The boy smiled, unsure if it was a joke, but something in Edward's face told him not to laugh. "Okay," he said. "She's safe now." Edward rented a room above the baker's shop. The walls were thin. The bed smelled like ash and old wheat, but it was dry. That night, he stood at the window, watching the stars blur behind the glass. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the wind trying to carry him away. Days passed. Edward helped around the stable, fixed a broken fence, carried feed, told no stories unless asked, and even then, kept them simple. Skye grew stronger. Her limp faded into memory. She still didn't run. Didn't need to. She had arrived. They both had. One afternoon, while sweeping out the stable, Edward felt something soft press against his side. Skye. No saddle. No rope. Just her head leaning into him. He set the broom aside and wrapped his arms around her neck. They stayed like that a long time. No one spoke, but everything was said. A week later, a traveler passed through town, a merchant with a tired mule and a stack of letters. Edward gave him one. Not sealed. Just folded. Inside only 5 words. "I made it. Still me." He didn't sign it. Didn't need to. People asked sometimes, later, about the crossing. How he'd survived. How the horse had. What they'd eaten. How they hadn't gone mad. He never answered directly. Sometimes he'd smile. Sometimes he'd say, "It wasn't just me out there." And sometimes he'd say nothing at all. Just look at the desert with a kind of reverence people usually reserve for cathedrals or graveyards. Because he knew. Somewhere out there, the sand still remembered their footsteps. Somewhere, the wind still carried her scent. And somewhere, that canyon still waited, like a secret kept by time itself. Edward stayed. He planted a small tree near the stable. It didn't grow fast, but it grew. Skye watched over it. Sometimes, in the early morning, she'd nudge it gently, as if she remembered the old silver tree and wanted this one to feel less alone. Edward would sit nearby, sometimes with a book, sometimes just with her. He didn't need much now. A place to rest, a friend to walk beside, and a sky that no longer threatened to swallow him whole. And so, the desert let them go. But it never truly released them. It stayed in their breath, in their bones, in the quiet spaces between words, because that kind of journey never really ends. It just becomes part of who you are. And when people passed through the town and asked about the man and the horse, they were told, "Oh, him? That's Edward, and the mare's name's Skye." And if they asked what their story was, most folks would just shrug and say, "You'd have to ask the wind."